And we want to take you live right now to New York City, where the captured Venezuelan leader, Nicolás Maduro, and his wife are set to make their first appearance on those federal narco-terrorism charges in a New York courtroom. You are looking live now on the left side of your screen at what that scene looks like there. Obviously, a security presence outside those doors. And let me show you what happened just hours ago. Maduro brought to the courthouse just after sunrise this morning. Here he is. You see him in the center there, walking away from that helicopter. At one point, flashing a thumbs up. Clearly defiant, it appears. Maduro and his wife set to be in court shortly here. He's been waiting hours for this appearance to start, and it is yet another twist in what has been a stunning 48 hours after the U.S. military attacked Venezuela in the middle of the night, late Friday into Saturday morning, to capture Maduro at his home in Caracas. I want to pull back the curtain a little bit on how this is going to work, as you see that live picture there. We've got a team of reporters inside court, including our Sam Brock here, transmitting notes back to us. We will know, the team you now see, Laura Jarrett, Danny Savalos, and others, we will know in real time when this is happening. We think this court appearance starting at noon is going to go roughly 20 to 30 minutes. Obviously, that's very fluid. We expect translation. We don't know yet if Maduro will enter a plea. With that said, it sets the stage for what is going to be a significant moment here for Maduro, for the Trump administration, for the Department of Justice. You saw Danny Savalos, who's outside court, to help explain it. But I want to start with our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett, who's going to be joining us here, working through these notes. Sam's going to run out as soon as this thing is over. And Laura, Maduro, Cilia Flores, his wife, now inside. And after the moments that we have seen over the last 48 hours, the large-scale military operation in the capital of Venezuela, in Caracas, the extraction of Maduro back here to the United States, him landing on U.S. soil in New York at an airport, being booked and processed and put behind bars, now starts what would be, in any other circumstance, a fairly typical court proceeding, like we might see for any other defendant, despite the fact that Nicolás Maduro is certainly not any other defendant.
Hallie, an arraignment is procedural. It's typical. It's what happens in hundreds of cases all over this country. And yet today, we are about to see an extraordinary moment of legal history. You outlined all of the geopolitical considerations that we saw play out over the last couple days, which are historic in their own right. But now we move to the legal process. And now that he is on U.S. soil, about to be in a U.S. courtroom in front of a federal judge there, he's entitled to certain rights, just like any other defendant. So let's start with the charges, Hallie. He's facing serious charges of narco-terrorism, cocaine importation conspiracy, and weapons charges that he faced 5 years ago, back in 2020, he was indicted by this very same office. The difference now, his wife, Cilia, also involved here, his son, and others also charged alongside him. Now that he has been formally booked and charged there at Hallie, he's going to be making his first appearance. At that appearance, it's the kind of thing where it could happen in a matter of 10 minutes, or it could take a while, depending on how much his defense attorneys want to preview some of their strategy, depending on what questions the Judge Hellerstein, might have in this case, a judge who is over 90 years old, been on the bench forever, knows this type of thing inside and out, will not be rattled by all of the various interests here. But still, it's the kind of thing that could go on for some time. So at this point, he will be advised formally of his charges, even though he knows what they are. We might see he or his attorneys enter a plea. We would expect of not guilty in this case, given his previous denial of these types of charges. And then there will be some discussion, I would imagine, of scheduling, Hallie. It sounds sort of boring or routine, but it's actually where we might first see our preview of how fast or slow this might go. It's sometimes where you see the defense attorney sort of posture about what they think is the invalidity of the charges. Sometimes you see them talk about the way in which a defendant has been apprehended and sort of the spectacle, if you will, over it. We saw this a lot in the Luigi Mangione case, Hallie, in this same district, where the defense attorneys talked about the way someone was sort of paraded through cameras. And we might see that again today. And then you might hear a discussion about discovery. Again, something routine where the government's going to have to disclose certain information now that he is, again, a criminal defendant, Hallie. And so all that is sort of what we would expect to see play out over the next hour or so there in Lower Manhattan.
Laura, stand by for us. I want to go to Danny Savalos, who is in Manhattan now, who is outside court. And Danny, a lot of questions yet to come, but at least one question has been answered, and that is who Maduro has apparently retained to defend him in, as Laura has laid out here, what will be these historic legal proceedings here. Somebody named Barry Pollock. What do we know about him, and why would Maduro have chosen him?
Well, this was a big question coming in because even though Maduro presumably lived large in his home country, at the same time, he's been subject to a lot of sanctions, and it was a question as to what cash would actually be available. It was possible this morning he would come in and either get appointed the public defender or CJA counsel, which is court-appointed counsel. But it appears that he may have secured private counsel, hired private counsel of his own. That attorney that you mentioned, a lot of experience in this courthouse, but remains to be seen what exactly or who else will be added to the defense team.
Danny, we talk about the legal proceedings, the legal motions that may come up. Again, potential for the plea today. What about this idea that Maduro and his defense team may challenge the way that he was removed from Venezuela and brought to the United States to face these charges? That is separate from, obviously, the charges laid out in the indictment, the narco-terrorism conspiracy, the cocaine charges, et cetera. But that may be something that comes up. Help us understand that.
The defense will absolutely challenge the means of apprehension and arrest, but they won't do it today. Today is just an arraignment. It's pretty straightforward. They're going to address issues of bail, appointment of counsel, the charges. Those motions hearings will come much later, and I assure you, those motions hearings will be the case. And by that I mean if he was apprehended unlawfully, then the case arguably goes away. But here's the interesting thing. Other than those motions challenging his apprehension, the actual criminal case against him is pretty straightforward. In fact, it could be the same case against for example, a drug kingpin in Minnesota, in Florida, and of course here in the Southern District of New York. And presumably the government brought this case in the Southern District because this district has a lot of experience in international criminal type cases like this. But there's a huge separation between the motions that will come challenging the apprehension of Maduro and then the criminal case itself. Those motions may go all the way to the Supreme Court because there are strong arguments on both sides for this either being an illegal apprehension or a perfectly lawful apprehension, depending on whether you ask the government or critics of the government.
Danny, as we take a look here, we're looking at the scene outside court, and you see these group of demonstrators that have shown up here. We have seen over the course of the last 2 days, for example, celebrations from Venezuelan Americans here in the United States, in South Florida and beyond, celebrations from Venezuelans back in Maduro's home country. And the optics of this, you know, we saw this image, and I want to have our team pull it up here. Maduro flashing that thumbs up to our New York station, WNBC's chopper, as it was overhead. You see it here. He's walking out. Now this is when he was earlier in Brooklyn. You see he held his hands up there for a thumbs up. You and I have talked before in other cases. Obviously, Maduro will be tried in a court of American law, but he also clearly has an eye on the court of public opinion back home in Venezuela.
Absolutely. And I've been covering high-profile cases at this courthouse for many, many years. And I have to say, I have never seen demonstrations of this magnitude. This is a peaceful but vocal crowd here today, Hallie. There are a lot of folks here, both in support of Maduro and in opposition to Maduro. And their chants can be heard over and over again. And, of course, I think for many of us here, it's difficult to even hear our IFBs through the din. But absolutely a lot of public support and public opposition to Maduro, and Maduro is likely considering how he can play the public that is favorable and in support of him.
Danny, I'm going to ask you to stand by for a second, and I want to bring in our national security correspondent, Tom Winter, who is also joining us. And Tom, this was a sweeping indictment. Maduro set to face a series of charges, obviously, and some of the allegations laid out against him and his wife include accusations that, for example, they ordered kidnappings, beatings, murders as part of this larger drug trafficking conspiracy, that they partnered with drug cartels, for example, to bring an enormous amount of cocaine into the United States and elsewhere. This is an indictment that has been in the works. It was brought in 2020 initially and continued to be updated and worked on by the prosecutors in the Southern District of New York.
Well, that's exactly right, Hallie. And really, it's an investigation that goes back almost 20 years. So folks understand the allegations here is that Venezuela permits and facilitates the shipment of 200 to 250 tons per year of cocaine from Latin America, from South America to the United States, as well to other countries. One of the primary ways that they do it, and really effectively what they've been charged with here, is facilitating the movement of cocaine from places like Colombia, from places in Latin America, through Venezuela, and then out. And because of its access and ability to transship that product to Europe, to Africa, and of course the United States. As the indictment says, there is a real premium on the price of cocaine in the United States. It was very lucrative for cartels to be able to get those narcotics out of South America into the United States, and Venezuela is really one of the prime ways that they do that with cocaine. I know it's been referenced about fentanyl. Fentanyl is not something that's discussed here in the indictment. There's no allegations of that. That primarily comes through the southern border with Mexico, either through the waterways or in the Pacific Ocean, or through the border, the land border that exists across the southern part of this country and Mexico. So this is more of a focus on cocaine. This investigation and the initial charges, and it goes back actually to 2011, when one of the members of the government in Venezuela was charged or brought to the United States, actually entered a plea of guilty on a number of counts back in June of this year. It's unclear whether or not that individual, identified as Hugo Armando Carval Barrios, whether or not that person is cooperating, but there is a guilty plea as a result of the charges going back to 2011. Then the investigation continued into a group called the Cartel of the Suns, and that's effectively this group that helps facilitate this cocaine. That's when the charges we got in March of 2020 involved Maduro himself. His wife added to the charges, somebody who herself has been a major part of politics in Venezuela, somebody who once represented the former leader of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, is an attorney. So this is somebody who's definitely been a part of this for some time, according to the United States and its federal prosecutors here in the course of this indictment. So the focus of this investigation is basically Venezuela is a hub of operations for cocaine to leave South America and Latin America to get to the United States, and then, as I mentioned, Europe and Africa. And that's been a focus, obviously, of military efforts. I know you've reported on, and our White House team has reported on extensively, these military strikes against boats leaving Venezuela. That's been something the U.S. says it's been focused on. And now you see, because the U.S. has designated as part of the Trump administration a number of Mexican cartels as effectively foreign terrorist organizations, their inclusion here in this indictment, Hallie.
I want to mention, too, that Maduro's son, Nicolás Maduro Guerra, is speaking right now in Venezuela. I want to show a little bit of video of this, repeatedly referring to his father as President Maduro, calling for him to be released, setting up what is a rather remarkable split screen now, where you have Maduro's son in Venezuela. This is the video here. Again, this is happening just literally in the last maybe 5 minutes or so, speaking to the Venezuelan National Assembly at the same time that his father in this split screen is in court in Manhattan and New York City to face these U.S.-brought charges. I want to go to Gabe Gutierrez, our man on the ground in Colombia. And Gabe, this is a family matter for the Maduro family. You look at Cilia Flores, of course, the Venezuelan first lady, who is also facing charges in this indictment, somebody who has been an influential figure in Venezuela in her own right, former attorney general there. She had obviously been part of the legislative branch. This is her being walked in, as you can see, by federal officials as she arrived on U.S. soil. She has also obviously retained an attorney here, or has a defense attorney, and is facing charges alongside her husband, Gabe.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. Incredibly influential. It's a bit of an understatement, really. And Nicolás Maduro calls her Cilita. And in the language of Chavismo, she is known as not just the first lady, but the first combatant. Now, yes, Nicolás Maduro met her about 30 years ago, and they have been inseparable ever since. They've been partners for a long time, got married a little over a decade ago. And when Maduro became president of Venezuela, she essentially faded a little bit into the background behind the scenes, but still wielded an immense amount of power. She is seen as the power behind the throne in Venezuela. So while a lot of people around the world may have looked at this indictment over the weekend and wonder why she was taken into custody, as you pointed out, Hallie, she wields a lot of influence inside Venezuela, and that's partly because she was seen as a huge proponent of Chavismo. Hugo Chavez, of course, the socialist leader of Venezuela before Maduro. Maduro seen as his protege. So this is a couple that has been a political power couple in the extreme sense. And the U.S. administration certainly feels that she was heavily involved in the trafficking of drugs alongside her husband, according to that indictment. So, yes, she is facing those charges with her husband, Nicolás Maduro, and it comes after an incredible political career that, again, she, as a first lady, has continued to wield an immense amount of power behind the scenes, Hallie.
Gabe, stick with me for a second, because you talk about what these leaders in Venezuela have been called. Cilia Flores, as you say, the first combatant, if you will. How about the Prince, of course, Maduro's son, his nickname as he is now speaking. Part of this sweeping indictment brought by the Department of Justice, obviously not somebody who was extracted by the United States in that military operation. As all of this is happening, these questions of leadership in Venezuela, I want to share with you, and again, we are getting this in live now. This is from Venezuelan State TV, and our team tells us that Maduro Guerra, the son here, has made a nomination on the legislative piece of it. The brother of Delcy Rodriguez has now been nominated to be president of the National Assembly. This is happening, and I say this not to get too in the weeds on Venezuela, the Venezuela legislative branch, but to point out that there are real questions now of leadership moving forward. We have seen this conflict between Delcy Rodriguez, again, to remind people, the vice president of Venezuela, who's been sworn in as the interim president, who has been defiant over the course of the last couple of days, largely saying Nicolás Maduro is the president of Venezuela, calling for him to be released as well. And President Trump setting up a conflict with her on that, Gabe.
Yeah, certainly. It can be argued in Venezuela right now. Delcy Rodriguez, you mentioned, she was elevated to be president over the last couple of days, but then you heard that contradictory words from President Trump saying that she was basically on board with what the U.S. administration has been doing. She, however, as you pointed out, has been defiant. There's been some question about exactly what conversation she has had with the administration, how much she has spoken to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and then the shocker over the weekend, Hallie, of President Trump coming in and basically downplaying the Venezuelan opposition. Maria Corina Machado accepted the Nobel Peace Prize not too long ago. She is in limbo at this point, and the president saying that she essentially did not have enough respect in the country to be the next opposition, or to be the next leader of Venezuela. So certainly a huge power vacuum at this point, and huge questions about how any government in Venezuela deals with the United States. We have been speaking about Secretary of State Marco Rubio yesterday saying that the U.S. would run Venezuela not in practice but in policy, and then President Trump on board Air Force One overnight saying that no, essentially the U.S. does plan to run Venezuela and certainly to take control of the oil reserves in the country. So you're rightly pointing out, we're looking at those live pictures inside Venezuela right now. The National Assembly essentially trying to figure out what happens next and what, if any, resistance will be posed to the U.S. administration. So many unanswered questions right now as we await this court appearance by Nicolás Maduro.
Cameras obviously bringing us what's happening in Venezuela. No cameras on the right side of your screen inside the courtroom. You're seeing the outside of the building now. Obviously, security officials flanking the doorway there. But Richard Engel, our chief foreign correspondent, who's joining us as well. Richard, the world is watching every minute of this.
They certainly are, and I'm watching what Nicolás Maduro's son is saying right now in Venezuela. I'm in Bogota, Colombia at the moment, but I'm reminded of a similar circumstance that I witnessed myself in Iraq about 20 years ago when Saddam Hussein was arraigned. Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, he was captured by American special forces, and then he was handed over to an Iraqi tribunal, which was being supervised by the U.S. military and the U.S. Justice Department. I was in the courtroom during Saddam's arraignment, and when Saddam Hussein was brought in, he looked around the court. I actually made eye contact with him. I was one of the few journalists in the room, and he refused to answer any questions. He was asked his name, and he answered the judge, the main judge, "You already know my name. I am the president of Iraq." He said, "This court is invalid. I don't accept its legitimacy." He was asked many procedural questions. If he could confirm where he was born, his hometown, his mother's names, typical arraignment type material, and his answer was consistent. stop with this nonsense. You know who I am. I'm the president of Iraq. I was illegally abducted by American forces. This is all a kangaroo court. And he refused to cooperate. And despite his refusal, he was ultimately sentenced to death and hanged.
Richard Engel, thank you for that. I'm going to ask you to stand by, but I want to bring you back to New York now because we are getting some action inside court. It is, again, we don't expect this appearance to start for another maybe 10 minutes or so, but we know that now, based on our team in the room sending us notes, that 5 assistant U.S. attorneys have now been seated at the prosecution table. Nicolás Maduro's defense attorney has arrived. He has shaken hands now with each of these prosecutors as the preparations now have begun. We don't have any word yet that the judge is in the room, that the proceedings have begun. Again, we think that's going to happen in just a couple of minutes from now. But I want to bring in Laura Jarrett on this. And Laura, as we've been talking about here, these proceedings unfold in a very prescribed way. There is a rhyme and reason to what is set to happen over the course of the next maybe 20, 30, 40 minutes or so, as we are getting close now to when Maduro will be arraigned in New York court.
Yeah, and we see everyone gathered there in court, as you said, the lead prosecutor pacing back and forth, waiting for the judge to take the bench, which will kick this off in just about 10 minutes, Hallie. We're also getting notes from our team there at just sort of the heavy security presence. A dozen DEA agents are hanging outside the courtroom. Obviously, they were the ones who brought him in and have a vested interest in this case. The defense attorney, Barry Pollack, who you mentioned, who also represented Julian Assange, who is no stranger to high-profile cases of some controversy, the one who is going to be apparently the lead defense attorney for Maduro. We had wondered who he would manage to get as counsel, and we now know that's who he has managed to retain, at least for now, Hallie. Usually the prosecution will go first in these situations and outline the charges, and the judge, his main job here today is to make sure that Maduro understands the charges against him. That's the purpose of the arraignment, when this sort of is the official kickoff point for legal proceedings of this nature, which also starts the clock for when a trial would need to happen. Hallie, obviously, we're a ways away from anything like that, but it's important to note that this is sort of a formal date that starts that clock for which he's entitled to a speedy trial should he want one. And in most cases, defense teams do not want one because they want to sort of kick the can down the road as much as possible. But it will be interesting to see, again, just sort of what the positioning in, what his defense attorney says in this case, and it will just sort of give us a preview, I think, of what's to come here in the days and months ahead. Just for folks that are wondering, about some of the charges, Hallie, it's worth noting Tom did a nice job outlining sort of the long history of drug trafficking allegations here. There's also this allegation of machine guns that have been used, Hallie, and I think some people might wonder, like, okay, Maduro's not being actually charged with having gone into, a drug trafficking situation with a machine gun. Maduro's not actually the one that's accused of bringing the drugs across the border to the United States himself, but you notice a conspiracy element here, and it's a tool that's used by prosecutors in situations like this all the time, because what it allows them to do is, as long as one member of the conspiracy is accused of using a machine gun in furtherance of the drug trafficking, it puts Maduro on the hook for it. And so it's just something to note here that I assume down the line we'll see his attorneys raise as an issue, but it's just worth noting the element of conspiracy here does a lot of work for prosecutors in cases like this, and is very helpful and is used as a point of leverage for them quite often in these types of drug conspiracies.
Is there any sense, Laura, when you talk about the defense attorney, as we are looking now, 11:53 Eastern time in New York City, we are just minutes away now from this arraignment beginning. Is there any sense that the defense team, if they were to try to delay, et cetera, as you say, stretch out the potential for this trial, push it down the road, that the clock has anything to do with the end of the Trump administration? In other words, like a 3-year clock on this, Laura, especially considering, obviously, that this is the Department of Justice that is bringing these charges. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And so much of that is really going to depend on the judge, Hallie. And that's why it'll be good to see his appetite in this case and sort of what he's laying out in terms of a schedule. Oftentimes, defense attorneys will try very hard to ask for dates way out in the future. And the judge
judge is the one to really hold the line on that. And so Judge Hellerstein in this case, as I mentioned, has been on the bench for a long time, appointed by Bill Clinton. He will really be in charge of whether or not this goes slow or this goes fast. I imagine, given all of the various strands, the legal, the political, all of the just the many interests at play here, the issues of national security, this is a case that is going to take years, not months.
Laura, stand by for us as we are seeing now that there is the sweep inside court with court officers looking for anything out of the ordinary here, checking the chair that Nicolás Maduro will sit in here. Again, these are all things that we would typically see in an arraignment, but the level of security, the level of scrutiny, the level of interest, off the charts, as we have seen some of these demonstrations outside court. We're going to work to get up a live shot of that because a crowd of people have gathered now in New York City there in Manhattan. And as we take a look at that, I want to go to Peter Alexander, our chief White House correspondent. As you see now these demonstrations here, Peter, you have some new reporting, I know, on what led President Trump to make this move now, specifically related to what one White House official tells you was a perception of arrogance on the part of Maduro.
That's right. A senior White House official, Hallie, described it to me as, quote, overt arrogance. And it was sort of the impression that Maduro, in the days ahead of that stunning secret raid, was acting, in effect, arrogant by, among other things, rejecting multiple offers to surrender, including one, the White House says, from the president himself directly to Maduro, and also his sort of regular public displays of dancing, as it was described to me. Those all played a role in helping persuade the president's team, his inner circle, that basically Maduro was not going to step down and that he was defying or mocking the pressure campaign by the president. Wasn't the only one, but certainly was on the list. It gives you a sense of the way that it was viewed as we pull back the curtain on the views from within the West Wing here. I would say the following, which is particularly striking as we talk about steps, the next steps. We're watching the legislative efforts taking place in Venezuela right now. It's clear that this sort of dramatic surprise raid in many ways may prove to be the easy part right now. What happens next, how President Trump is able to begin this new challenge, what he's able to do with it, effectively transforming Venezuela from what he has called a broken country, or a mess in his words, into a stable, functioning one. That is the real challenge. And as we heard from the president first in his remarks on Saturday, he said, we are running Venezuela. We heard from Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State, just yesterday on Meet the Press, saying, in effect, well, we're not literally running it, we're running the policy around it. But the president then again last night said, we are running it, we are in charge right now. As I speak to senior officials here at the White House, they make clear that it's not like the U.S. is governing what happens in Venezuela right now, despite the president's language, but really that it is sort of trying to use what they call maximum leverage in terms of the embargo on Venezuelan oil, using that as sort of its lever right now, cracking down on the oil in that country even before American oil companies go in. And that's the real pressure point that the White House is using to try to influence the actions of Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president, and other leaders in that country right now. As it relates to Rodriguez, it's worth noting right now, immediately after the arrest and capture of Nicolás Maduro, we heard from Rodriguez basically saying it was an illegal kidnapping, saying that there's only one president in her country. And then she had a more diplomatic tone just yesterday, in effect saying that her country is calling for dialogue and peace, not war. The president basically making very clear that if she doesn't give the U.S. total access, referring to oil and beyond, that she would face a situation even greater, even more harsh than that Maduro himself had faced. So these are all the sort of competing tentacles in this situation right now as it relates to the U.S.'s effort to try to run a country that is significantly larger than the state of Texas here, with 20 million people, 8 million of whom have left the country, during which time Nicolás Maduro has been in power. In the White House, Hallie, not saying that the president is watching right now, indicating that he has a lot going on, but I can tell you, inside the West Wing, the TVs are on all of the television networks that are presently covering these live events in New York City.
And we are now perhaps just seconds away from the beginning of this arraignment as the clock is ticking towards noon here in the East in New York City. where Nicolás Maduro is making that first court appearance. His wife, Cilia Flores, as well, facing those narco-terrorism conspiracy charges here in the United States in that sweeping indictment brought by the Department of Justice. Back in Venezuela, Maduro's son is leading remarks to the Venezuelan National Assembly as that continues to unfold. He, too, mentioned in this indictment, but obviously not extracted from Venezuela. And on the right side of your screen, you're seeing some of the demonstrations in New York City. Any moment now, we expect to see Maduro's defense attorney, Barry Pollock, begin with these proceedings along with the lead prosecutor. They have arrived. They are in the room. They have greeted each other and are now waiting for the judge to arrive to begin this. This is, of course, after the U.S. military launched a secret attack on Venezuela early Saturday morning, capturing both Maduro and his wife. We have seen images of Maduro at the heliport being transported from where he has been behind bars now for the last 48 hours. A dramatic and historic series of events for the Trump administration, as President Trump, as you heard our chief White House correspondent Peter Alexander mention, is undoubtedly watching this unfold. I want to bring in our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett, now, as we are at the top of the hour. Any minute this will begin, Laura, and just to reset for our viewers here, we think it's going to run maybe 20 to 30 minutes, likely to have Spanish translation, of course. We do not have cameras in court. If you're wondering why you're not seeing those images, remember, this is federal court, no cameras, but we have teams of reporters in the room. They're sending back real-time live notes that we are checking and updating literally second by second here. We do not know yet, Laura, if Maduro will enter a plea, right?
We don't, Hallie, but I would expect that he would enter a plea or his attorney will enter one on his behalf. That's what you would typically see in a first appearance like this. It doesn't mean that circumstances can't change down the line. We've seen plenty of cases where people change their plea down the line for whatever reason. But I would expect we would see that today, just as a matter of formality. It just depends on whether he does it or his attorney does it. It doesn't really make any difference. But we would expect to see that at some point for both he and his wife, who's represented by separate counsel. I should note, Hallie, she's not represented by Barry Pollock. She's represented by an attorney out of Texas named Mark Donnelly, who's a former federal prosecutor, plenty of experience in this industry as well. And so in this type of thing where you see two co-defendants, they can either go back to back. They might be seated at counsel table side by side. I should note Maduro has walked in. He's shaking hands with his attorney. Again, this is according to our notes that are coming from inside the courtroom. He's wearing an orange shirt and a blue shirt over it with beige pants, orange slippers, Hallie, so it appears he's essentially wearing his court uniform. He's not in a suit and tie, which we would expect in this circumstances. We've seen him sort of paraded out through New York when he landed here and going through the helipad, also wearing similar gear. He's putting on a headset, Hallie, so that he can hear the Spanish translation. His wife, Cilia, is sitting just 2 seats away from him, Hallie, at counsel table. As I said, as is typical in a co-defendant case, you can see something like that. She, too, is wearing prison garb, and the judge is now entering to take the bench, Hallie.
We are seconds away now from this arraignment for Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores. With the judge now in the room, our team of reporters there, you are looking at the outside of court here. Security at the door, no cameras in court. The demonstration on the right side of your screen. Danny Ceballos, our legal analyst, is joining us as well. He has made his way to the front of the courthouse here. And Danny, it is quite a scene.
Absolutely. As I said before, I mean, this is the biggest crowd I've ever seen at any of these high-profile cases. And as we all know, the Southern District of New York is no stranger to high-profile celebrity, infamy, cases of all kinds of magnitude, and on a monthly basis almost. And yet, this may be the largest group I've ever seen protesting, counter-protesting, all peaceful, plenty of volume, as you can hear the sirens going by as we speak. The police presence, too, is beyond anything I've ever seen before. Even this morning, seeing them right by the helipad, even the images we saw coming in from the helipad didn't fully show all the other police and military presence close by. So although this is a scene that has a lot of high-profile cases, I've never seen one quite like this, Hallie.
Maduro has retained a defense attorney, Barry Pollock. Mark Donnelly is representing Cilia Flores as well. What do we know about them, Danny?
Yeah, as we've heard about before, Pollock has represented Julian Assange, so no stranger to high-profile cases. Other counsel for Maduro's wife, is a former federal prosecutor, so we know that they've got competent counsel as expected. And I did wonder to the extent to which they would be able to retain counsel in time for the hearing. It's not unusual for the public defender to step in on a temporary basis, but whatever the case may be, the Maduros moved quickly to get counsel to represent them and be waiting for them here today, just hours after they were apprehended and brought to New York.
Danny Ceballos, thank you. As the arraignment now has begun, the judge has begun the proceedings for Nicolás Maduro. We're going to pause now to allow the other stations to join our special report.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Hallie Jackson.
Good day. We are coming on the air with breaking news right now. The captured Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro is making his first appearance here in the United States on federal narco-terrorism charges in New York. You see the images here. No cameras in court. On the right side of your screen, that is the outside of the building with the security in front. On the left, some of the demonstrations now outside of that building with Maduro walking into that courtroom just moments ago, along with his wife, who also faces charges. This comes after a stunning 48 hours. The U.S. military launching that secret operation early Saturday morning, attacking Venezuela, then capturing Maduro and his wife at their home in Caracas, bringing them both to the U.S. President Trump has accused Maduro of running a drug cartel. And just to give you a sense of how this is going to work over the course of the next 20 to 30 minutes, we have a team of reporters inside the courtroom. Again, no cameras. That includes our correspondent, Sam Brock. They are sending us notes in real time so that we know what is happening. We do expect translation here. We do not yet know if Maduro will enter a plea. We have our legal analyst, Danny Ceballos, outside court to help explain what it all means. Our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett, is also reading these notes alongside us. Sam's going to join us in a minute. Laura, let me start with you because this historic arraignment has officially begun.
It has, Hallie. It has officially begun with Maduro walking in, shaking hands with his attorneys. He put on a headset so that he can hear the Spanish translation. His wife, Cilia, just sitting 2 seats away from him. They're both donning prison garb that we've seen them in over the last 24 hours or so. And the judge has now taken the bench, Hallie. He's explaining to the defendants that his job is to ensure that this is a fair trial and fair proceeding, and that he's going to summarize the indictment against them. He's walking through the counts in detail. Count 1 for narco-terrorism, explaining that he's been accused of conspiring with others to distribute cocaine, as we've seen outlined in this indictment. Hallie, walking through the various codes, all the formalities. Count 2 for cocaine importation conspiracy. Again, walking through it in some level of detail. And then I imagine he's going to turn to the prosecution. We will hear the defense attorneys, of course, speak today. As you mentioned, could possibly enter a plea. I would expect that Barry Pollock there on behalf of Maduro, President Maduro, would enter a plea of not guilty, and Mark Donnelly will do the same on behalf of his wife, Cilia Flores. The judge still walking through the different counts at this point, Hallie, and most of this, obviously, a formality, but it's also important for the record, Hallie, because there's a court stenographer. As we have our own team writing down every word, there's someone in court there detailing every last word that's said by the judge in this case, Hallie. And so he's still on the bench walking through each of the 4 counts against Maduro and his wife.
Laura, I'm going to let you take a look at those notes while I bring in Danny Ceballos there, who is at court outside as we are seeing those demonstrations that have built throughout the morning. We know that Maduro was brought here after sunrise. He has been waiting for hours for this moment. And Danny, while everything we've seen over the last 48 hours has been dramatic and unexpected, what is going to happen from here? As you see on the right side of your screen, Maduro flashing a defiant thumbs up to our NBC News New York helicopter above him there early this morning. Everything that we will see during these court proceedings, Danny, unfold typically.
Yeah, this case will proceed after today like any other federal criminal case. Now, there will certainly be motions to challenge the arrest of Maduro abroad and the U.S.'s use of extraterritorial jurisdiction. Those will result in a delay of the trial. By statute, it's not technically a waiver of speedy trial, but while those motions are decided, that adds to the time until this case gets to trial. So that's why I would predict a trial date, realistically, not until 2027. Although the defendant does not waive speedy trial, by filing those motions. But in that sense, this case will proceed after today like any other drug conspiracy and firearms case in this courthouse, although it will certainly take longer because of those motions to challenge the extraction of Maduro from Venezuela. And the answer to whether or not the U.S. lawfully arrested and apprehended Maduro is really anyone's guess. There are compelling arguments on both sides, but the reality is this matter has never been specifically litigated under these facts, and definitively so. You can point to precedent in the case of Manuel Noriega in 1989, but there are factual differences there. So we really don't know what the outcome's going to be of the motions to dismiss that are surely coming. So we don't know what's going to happen, but I can guarantee those motions are coming.
Stand by. Laura, let me go back to you, because now for the first time on U.S. soil in this court proceeding, Maduro is being addressed directly by this federal judge.
He is, Hallie, and what a fall this has been for the president of a sovereign nation now in a courtroom, which I can tell you is not particularly fancy, in Lower Manhattan, being addressed by the judge, Judge Hellerstein, asking him, "Are you Nicolás Maduro?" Maduro standing for the judge at this point, and the judge telling him there will be a time and place for all of this. "I only want to know one thing. Are you Nicolás Maduro?" And Maduro is going to address the judge. We don't yet know whether he's addressing the judge in English or Spanish. I imagine it's English. We see that Maduro is saying, "I am." The judge is saying you have the right to read the entire indictment. Again, Hallie, I mentioned part of the purpose of an arraignment like this from a legal standpoint is to make sure that the defendant is aware of the charges against him in a case like this where he has perfectly competent defense counsel. Almost always the answer is yes. Barry Pollock, his defense attorney, is answering for him, saying he has the indictment and counsel has summarized it and he has waived formal reading. Hallie, all that means is that this will go a little bit faster if the prosecutors don't have to read chapter and verse every word of what they're alleging in this indictment. It's something you see all the time where the defense counsel waives a reading of the formal indictment. It's something they're entitled to, but they don't have to do it.
Well, what's interesting, Laura, just to jump in here, is that we're seeing now Maduro, it appears, addressing the court directly. It is translated, saying he has the indictment in his hands for the first time, saying he would rather read it personally, Laura.
Yeah, and perhaps that's because he knows that all eyes are on this courtroom in Lower Manhattan right now, and making clear that, a position of I'm not going to be sort of bullied around in this case. He says, "I am the president of Venezuela. I was captured at my home in Caracas." Again, knowing all of the eyes on this right now, Hallie, interesting to see what the first words are from Nicolás Maduro. We heard, just brief utterances from him over the weekend, I believe saying Happy New Year when we saw him just in those brief moments over the weekend after he was brought to the United States. But this is certainly the most lengthy statement we've heard for him. And the judge also saying to him if he can't afford an attorney, that he's entitled to one. And that he will be released prior to trial unless I find reasons to hold you. Obviously, the government in this case is going to mount a vigorous effort to hold him. There's not a chance that the Justice Department is going to want to release him prior to trial. But again, this is the type of arguments that you're going to see mounted.
Let me go to Danny for a second, Laura, and I'm going to let you read in on these notes, because Danny, Maduro is addressing the court now. As the judge is reading him the variety of rights that he has, Maduro is saying, "I did not know of these rights. Your Honor has informed them of me now." Remarkable, Danny, when you think about the last 48 hours for Nicolás Maduro, who was leading Venezuela up until about 2 days ago, who has been extracted in a large-scale military operation by the United States to face this American federal judge in New York. All of it very intentional. He just also pled not guilty. So, Danny and Laura, a significant moment here. The leader of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, here in the United States to face those charges, pleading not guilty in this Manhattan court, telling a judge, "I am the president of my country." Danny, not unexpected that this would be his plea, but a historic and significant moment.
very historic, very significant. And it goes without saying, defendants don't normally make statements like Maduro did. And I wondered whether Maduro might take the opportunity, knowing that his words would be broadcast beyond just simply what most defendants say, which is, I am who I am and not guilty, entering their plea. But instead, Maduro here making something of a statement. And of course, arraignments are normally very quick proceedings, but I have found, and I'm sure Laura would agree with me, that anytime you have a translator involved, you can expect to double the time. But that makes it maybe from 20 to 40 minutes. But yes, a historic moment to be sure here today in this courthouse.
And Laura, not only is Nicolás Maduro pleading not guilty, he is also mounting somewhat of a character defense already, telling the judge, I'm a decent man.
I am a decent man. I am still the president of my country, Hallie, which is just sort of fascinating to watch how he's mounting his own both legal defense, but also almost a political one, mentioning his position has not been formally given up in any way. I wonder what type of relationship he has with his attorney, Barry Pollock, which he doesn't appear to have interjected at any point here, other than to say that his client had waived a reading of the indictment, and that it appeared that Maduro sort of took over, Hallie, if you will. As any defense attorney knows, they get nervous when their clients start freelancing. But obviously, we'll wait to see if he says anything else of any consequence. The judge saying that he will now, his deputy will now formally arraign him. Maduro is still standing there in court, Hallie, as this continues to play out. It'll be interesting to see also whether his wife takes a similar approach.
That's
we
right.
haven't yet seen anything, at least by way of her we're talking yet, but she will get that opportunity as well. It'll be interesting to see whether she too makes a similar sort of speech when she's able to.
Danny, is it your sense, based on what we're seeing from inside court here, that the judge may be giving Maduro a degree of leeway to make these kinds of statements and comments, talking about how he's a decent man, how he's still the president of his country? Or is this something that would typically happen for any other defendant?
No, it would not happen for any other defendant. But let me qualify that. Arraignments go on in hundreds of courthouses, both federal and state, every day. And defendants often are very confused about the purpose of an arraignment. Very often defendants, especially in state courthouses, they come in and they want to make an argument. They want their case dismissed. Really, the arraignment is for the limited purpose of informing the defendant of their rights, giving them the opportunity to read the indictment, and a discussion of bail. And every judge handles his or her courtroom in the way they see fit. So I think your instinct is right. Likely the judge allowed Maduro to make limited statements. We're listening to them in real time here, but likely the judge is giving him a little leeway. But I am certain that most judges, including Judge Hellerstein, if Maduro goes on too long, the judge will reel it in, because the purpose of an arraignment is simply not to grandstand. It's not for motions. It's not for challenging jurisdiction. It's a very straightforward appearance. But it is up to the judge the degree to which he wants to let Maduro make some minor statements here.
The attention inside court has now turned to Maduro's wife, Cilia Flores, who is also being indicted here by the U.S. Department of Justice. She is an influential figure in Venezuela and has been in her own right, the former attorney general in that country. She's been accused in this indictment of working alongside her husband to partner in this massive drug trafficking alleged conspiracy, this narco trafficking conspiracy, accused on her own of accepting bribes, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth as part of that as well. And Laura, she is now addressing the court.
Hallie, and similarly, she is saying, I am the First Lady of Venezuela, again, trying to position herself still in power, still in a position of strength and authority. She was asked to stand by the judge. He said to her, you heard my summary of the indictment. She said her attorney received it. She heard the summary. She acknowledged that her attorneys are here by her side. And the judge, again, going through sort of the routine statements of, you know, if you can't afford an attorney, the court will provide one. How do you plead to the counts? And she has pleaded, as did her husband, Hallie, not guilty. She's saying completely innocent.
These dramatic moments inside court, just to remind folks, no cameras there, which is why we're reading you these notes from inside. And Danny, the proceedings against these two, they are separate but parallel. Fair?
Absolutely. I mean, they're in the same indictment. They are co-defendants. They're considered co-conspirators. So the case against them, while factually distinct, is going to be largely identical in the sense that you only need to convict the conspiracy itself to hold all the co-conspirators liable for everything every member of the conspiracy did. And we talked about earlier how you see those charges of, for example, machine guns. They don't necessarily have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Maduro himself handled machine guns, but rather that he was part of a conspiracy that used firearms to achieve their unlawful drug trafficking objective. So, as we've discussed several times before, this is, in many ways, a straightforward drug and firearm case in a jurisdiction that handles more than its fair share of drug and firearm cases. So, in that sense, you may say it is typical, dare I say typical, for a case like this. But of course, the international implications and the certain challenges to U.S. extraterritorial jurisdiction to come will be very significant. I should point out, Hallie, that many folks may not know the U.S. already exercises extraterritorial criminal jurisdiction in many instances. I've handled cases in which our Coast Guard is thousands of miles away from the U.S. in open seas, boarding ships and indicting and arresting individuals who have never set foot in the U.S., who are nationals of another country. And so this is nothing new, extraterritorial jurisdiction. However, under these facts, the extraction of someone who claims to be the president of a foreign country, because the government's going to say Maduro is not the president, but bringing a head of state to the U.S. in this manner, that will certainly be challenged, and nobody can say for certain whether or not what the government here did was lawful or unlawful.
Danny, let me ask you about something that is happening in court in literally the last 15 seconds or so. The judge has informed Nicolás Maduro that he has a right to consult with consular officials. Maduro is taking him up on that offer, essentially, saying, yes, we want that kind of a visit. What does that mean, and why would Maduro accept that?
Yes, that is a right. You do have a right, and in fact, that right goes both ways, often for Americans who are abroad and find themselves arrested. But it's often really a hollow opportunity. The consulate is very limited in the assistance that they can give. And again, that works both ways, both for Maduro here in the U.S. and, of course, for U.S. citizens who find themselves arrested abroad. The consulate can help with some minor things, but the true advocate for Maduro and his wife now will be their lawyers. Those are the people that can really get things done for the Maduros going forward. But, of course, they do have that right to confer with members of the consulate. They will get that opportunity, and presumably that will happen relatively soon.
Laura, let me go back to you here, because at this point, the prosecution is now going through what they have described as some housekeeping items, basically logistics as part of this court proceeding, after we have seen probably the most dramatic moments of the course of the last hour or so, which is, of course, Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, pleading not guilty. In Spanish, again, this is being translated as both of them have made defiant statements about how they are still, in their view, the president and first lady of Venezuela.
Yeah, Hallie, defiant, saying, I'm still the first lady, I'm still the president. He's saying, I was captured at my home, I've done nothing wrong, I'm innocent, I'm not guilty, I'm a decent man, I'm still the president of my country. Defiant words there from Maduro in court. At this point now, the prosecutor walking through, again, some of the more housekeeping matters as it relates to their obligations to turn over any exculpatory information to the defense, things that could help the defense team. You might wonder why they would do that. They're required to under the law. Prosecutors have a requirement to do that, and if they don't do that, it can be disastrous for their case. The judge explaining the consequences for noncompliance can be dismissal of charges or dismissal of the entire case. So he's walking through the prosecution's obligation to turn that over, the prosecutor acknowledging that order, and so that's being formally entered. We're also getting just some color from inside there, which I assume we'll get a lot more once Sam Brock comes out from the courtroom, Hallie, but just that Maduro is moving around in his seat. He's looking over to look at his papers, appearing engaged there, according to our team that's watching all these proceedings play out in court. I would imagine, Hallie, this will not go on for much longer now that he's pled guilty. He's been informed of the charges. They're going to walk through probably a couple more procedural matters. Again, because all of this is happening with the benefit of an interpreter, it will move a little bit slower, but this is probably coming to a conclusion in the next, I imagine, 10 minutes or so, Hallie.
Laura, stand by for us. It is not just, of course, our team watching every minute of this from the courtroom, but the rest of the world, including Venezuelans, as we take you now live to the region, to Colombia, where Gabe Gutierrez is standing by. All of this happening, as we have heard from Nicolás Maduro's son, almost simultaneously as his father is being arraigned in federal court in the United States. Maduro's son, also named in this indictment, was not extracted by the United States. But, Gabe, this is coming at a moment of a paradigm shift for the region and of the expansion of what's being called the Trump doctrine in Latin America.
Yeah, certainly, Hallie, and a lot is happening. And right now in this region, there is a profound sense of uncertainty. We're seeing it right now here in this border town in Colombia. We're in Cucuta, and the Venezuelan border is right behind me. That's the border crossing right there. You see the the Colombian military has set up these tanks right behind me, and they're all watching what's unfolding right now in lower Manhattan. Now, I have been actually speaking with Venezuelans throughout this morning. Right behind me, they cross through this border crossing each day. We spoke with a family just a short time ago that came with all of their belongings that they could because they were so worried about what was going to happen. One man didn't want to speak to me at length talking about politics because they still feel for their family members inside Venezuela. Another woman I spoke with said she was very grateful for what President Trump had done. Still, others in this region are very worried about what happens next. You mentioned the remarks by Maduro's son inside the National Assembly, and there's a huge question about the power vacuum inside Venezuela, the opposition in Venezuela, the military leaders there. Who will control Venezuela, and what is next for the Trump administration? The president making some strong comments about other countries in this region, including Colombia, including Cuba, and also making remarks about Mexico as well. So certainly there's a lot of people in this region wondering what this Trump doctrine means going forward as we continue to watch those ongoing developments in Lower Manhattan.
And amid those sweeping questions, Gabe, and I want to go back to Laura Jarrett now, the more mundane logistical procedures of this arraignment here, that is, of course, anything but typical when you look at the geopolitical implications. It is a significant moment, Laura. And just to bring folks into this here, again, minute by minute, we are getting updates from our team inside court. At this point, prosecutors are going over some various housekeeping notes. The judge is speaking. Interestingly, Laura, the Maduros, it sounds like, have asked to keep the notes that they've been taking in court about these proceedings.
They have, and the judge is saying, I believe that you can keep them. The prosecutor acknowledging that they're going to work with the defense counsel. Sometimes you see defendants want to keep notes like this, especially when the notes could potentially contain attorney-client communications. There's a lot of sensitivity around that. There's also, security considerations about what they can take with them when they're in federal custody. But the judge saying in this case, I believe you can keep them. There's also a letter apparently from Barry Pollock and Mark Donnelly, the two defense counsel in this case. We haven't seen this letter quite yet, but it's talking about the various procedures that they're asking to be taken in this case to work with the defense, between the prosecution and the defense, so the defense can represent their clients zealously and fully. Interestingly, also, Hallie, Pollock, the, again, counsel for Nicolás Maduro, is saying he's not seeking release at this time. Not seeking release of his client.
Laura?
Because he knows his client's not going to get out in this case right now, Hallie. He knows, given all the considerations here, he doesn't have to ask for release at this time. He can change. Obviously, that at any time, and he can seek it at another point. But he's saying he's not seeking release at this time without prejudice, which means that he can obviously make an application for bail later on. And so he's asking for some time there and to be able to do that. And the judge will obviously consider that at the appropriate time when he makes that request.
Well, the other interesting piece of this, too, Laura, and this is coming in seconds ago, is that the defense attorney for Nicolás Maduro has now raised the question of the legality of the military extraction. Laura, you and I and Danny have talked over the course of the last couple of days about this. Not unexpected, of course, that the defense team would bring this up, questioning the legality of the Trump administration, the military going in to remove Maduro forcibly in that operation from Venezuela.
And that's something that's going to get raised in a motion. That'll be a legal filing that will outline all the reasons that they think it was invalid. And then that will kick off what will, inevitably be a protracted series of arguments, right? The defense will write their side. The prosecutor will write their side. And then the judge will hold a hearing and hear arguments from both on that. And so that's why I say it will take a while. That's not something that the judge would be expected to resolve today. That's something that's going to require a fair amount of research from the judge and his clerks to figure out exactly what issues are at play, and knowing that whatever happens, it will get appealed. And so that's something that's going to take a fair amount of time. The judge, acknowledging that some dates will have to be discussed here, and the defense attorney saying he expects there will be voluminous discovery, meaning what exactly the government has on Maduro and all that went into his apprehension.
Danny, let me go to you here, because they've also set a date for what sounds like, I don't know if it's firm yet, but they're discussing mid-March now for the next court appearance, roughly 60 days from now. What do we expect to happen then?
That date will likely, you'll see an update on the issues of discovery, and then we'll get a little more idea of where they're going to go with motions. And Laura was absolutely right. This is a 30-year mandatory minimum case and a firearms and drug case. There's virtually no chance at this stage that Maduro was going to get bail on a case like this. So you move forward and you really focus on the important elements and Maduro's best chance for an actual possible dismissal of this case on issues that are very likely to at least go to the Court of Appeals, if not the United States Supreme Court. And that's whether or not the apprehension of Maduro and his wife in Venezuela by law enforcement and U.S. military was itself lawful. And actually is a secondary issue, because there is case law saying that even if an apprehension abroad violates that country's law or international law, it doesn't necessarily foreclose domestic prosecution here in the U.S. So this is a very complex issue. It will require a significant amount of discovery and information before the motions can be fully briefed.
I want to go to Courtney Cubie now, our senior national security correspondent, because we've just learned, too, in court that there are apparently, according to Cilia Flores' defense attorney and Maduro's defense attorney, some health and medical issues. They are asking for Maduro and his wife to get the appropriate medical help in detention. And Cilia Flores' attorney is saying that she has some, what he calls, severe bruising on her rib that is going to need some attention here. Courtney, it sounds as though that is obviously the after effect, the fallout from that military operation in which Maduro and Flores were taken from their home in Caracas.
Yeah, well, Hallie, when we were working on the possible sort of timeline of how this all unfolded overnight Saturday night, one of the things that we were trying to figure out is exactly how long Maduro and his wife were on the USS Iwo Jima and then on the U.S. aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford. We've asked the question but not gotten the answer, frankly, about whether when they brought them on board, they did medical checks and they sort of established a baseline of anything like that. Like, did they have bruising? Did they have any injuries that may have been a product of or a result of that late night raid that took them both into custody? We haven't gotten an answer to that, but the reality is that's pretty standard if they were going to bring them onto a U.S. military ship like that, and they definitely have those kinds of capabilities, if not on the Iwo Jima, which is an amphib, a pretty large ship, definitely on the aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford. But even if not, when they would have brought them into the United States up to New York, they would have most likely gone through some kind of medical checks there as well. One thing that I'm just fascinated by this entire process, and I know we've been talking about this all weekend, is just the overall legality of this military operation in and of itself. We can't lose...
Which, by the way, Maduro's defense attorney has raised now in court. We expect that to be a legal motion that happens over the course of the next several months.
That is going to be a fascinating discussion, how that plays out, because we can't lose sight of the fact here of what occurred. There's a lot of emphasis on the fact that the United States military And law enforcement officials went in the dead of the night. They picked up Nicolás Maduro. They were executing on this indictment and his wife.
Yeah.
But what we can't forget is that in advance of that, essentially setting the conditions for that extraction team to move in, the United States military took a series of military strikes against the Venezuelan military, a sovereign nation's military forces. And then, as we later learned on Saturday, there was also a number of different gun battles that also occurred, resulting in injuries on the American side and, we believe, deaths in Venezuela.
Court, thank you. 30 minutes of history in that courtroom that you are looking at in New York City as Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, have been escorted out. The Venezuelan leader saying in court, "I am the president of Venezuela." His wife saying, "I am the first lady." Both of them pleading not guilty to these charges of narco-terrorism conspiracy brought against them by the United States after that military operation just 48 hours ago. Laura Jarrett, this arraignment is winding down. Maduro and his wife are now out of the room. They are presumably heading back to that facility where they had been booked and processed, and both of them will remain behind bars.
A place behind bars, Hallie, which is not pleasant. A place that has housed the likes of Sean Diddy Combs, Sam Bankman-Fried, Luigi Mangione, not to mention a host of other high-profile defendants. A far cry from where they were in Venezuela as the president and first lady of their country. We haven't seen any more signs that they made any more statements before they left. But we did see, according to our team there in court, that Maduro stopped to look at the gallery before he was escorted out of the courtroom. Again, probably taking in the scene that was just playing out before him, a dramatic scene. Also noteworthy, Hallie, that his attorney, Barrick Pollitt, signaled the legality of the issues surrounding how he was extracted out of Venezuela, calling it a military abduction, which I think is our first sort of peek at where this is going, Hallie. It's not surprising, given all the circumstances that we saw play out on Saturday of how he was extracted, but I think it's where this is going next in terms of the legal battles ahead, which I mentioned will be quite lengthy, but we do expect, at least according to the judge here, that they will be back in court on March 17th at 11 a.m. there in New York, Hallie.
I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander. As we've noted here, Peter, the world has been watching what has unfolded here in court, listening to what Maduro and his wife have been talking about, and President Trump, White House officials keyed in on this as well.
I think that's right, Hallie. In many ways, this is bringing the world stage to an American courtroom. The world is watching, even if they're listening, in fact, since they can't see it for themselves. What is happening behind those doors here in Lower Manhattan at this time? No indication yet whether the president himself has been watching this play out or getting updates from his staff here with the White House, but we know the televisions inside the West Wing were tuned in to this over the course of the day. A couple things I want to pick up on. First, what we heard from Maduro that Laura just noted, that in effect he said that this was a military abduction. That reflects language not too dissimilar from what Delcy Rodriguez herself said, the interim, the acting president of that country, the Maduro loyalist who had served as vice president beneath Maduro immediately after he was captured, saying that it was an illegal kidnapping, saying there was only one president in that country. We heard from President Trump, who was particularly fierce in his language, speaking about Rodriguez, saying in effect that unless she gives the United States total access and meets America's demands right now, that she will face a situation, a resolution that is even more harsh than that Maduro had seen so far. Rodriguez, notably a bit more diplomatic, softer in her tone late yesterday, saying that she and the Venezuelan people deserve peace and dialogue, not war. And it really underscores this unique challenge that the president is facing right now. In many ways, what's happened so far was the easy part, in spite of it being a stunning, surprise, daring raid that happened before dawn on Saturday. The real challenge for the president right now, in many ways, is what he faces ahead, transforming Venezuela, which he has described as a mess, as a broken country, into a stable, functioning one. Overnight, he repeated his assertion that we are in charge, that the U.S. is in charge right now, while noting among his immediate priorities sending in American oil companies to take over Venezuela's oil supply and repair the infrastructure there. As he has said, we are running the country. We heard from Marco Rubio just yesterday, speaking to my colleague Kristen Welker on Meet the Press, that we're not running the country, we're running it in terms of its policy. But the president, when he had an opportunity to clarify later, said, I know it's controversial, basically, but we are in charge. As I've been speaking to senior officials here at the White House, they say that the U.S. is in charge, but it's not literally running the country. In fact, the U.S. is basically exerting maximum leverage or pressure on Venezuela and its leadership right now as it relates to oil, demanding that Venezuela basically bow to the president's demands.
Peter, thanks. I'm going to ask you to stand by, as we have now learned that obviously Nicolás Maduro and his wife are out of the courtroom. They are departing court any second now. We do expect, just to give you a sense, we do expect to have a live look at that. And remember why that is interesting here. Earlier in the morning, just after sunrise, we saw Maduro being transported from that facility where he's been spending, obviously, the last day and a half behind bars to court. He'll be taken back there. And in those images, Maduro clearly aware of the optics, clearly aware of the cameras flashing that thumbs up to the rest of the world here. And you heard him in court sounding that same defiant tone. I want to bring in Tom Winter as we're waiting for that live shot to come up. The second we get it, you will see it right here. And Tom, when you talk about the legal proceedings set to move forward, part of this is going to involve classified information, presumably, given the nature and the scope of the indictment against Maduro and his wife.
Yes, and we know that, Hallie, because the federal prosecutors have to tell the court that they intend to use classified information and that they need to bring in the attorneys in this case to get them to sign documents, make sure they're cleared to receive that information, and also make a promise that they're not going to make that information public in the course of their filings, or so to do it under seal. That's something that has already taken place in this case. As we mentioned before, this proceeding began earlier today, that, in fact, there had been a prosecution going back to 2011. And I want people to think about this as we wait for our colleague Sam Brock to get mic'd up, because we did see him leaving the courtroom. It's a trip I've taken too many times before. But basically, in this case, if you want to think of the cartel of the Suns here, this is this group that federal prosecutors say is responsible for using violence, using money, using illegal means to get the drugs out of Colombia and other places in South America through Venezuela. That's why they say we're here in the first place. If you want to equate that to the American mob, that's effectively what the Maduros have been charged with here, is basically being at the top of that, if you will. That's the allegation, that they received compensation and money and were involved in corruption in order to let these drugs go through. But a part of that will no doubt be intercepts that the U.S. has of conversations, discussions that have occurred, basically their ability to electronically eavesdrop in order to help make these cases. That's how a lot of these drug cases are put together. This was a case that was put together by the DEA well over a decade in coming up with it, and then was charged, Maduro specifically, back in March of 2020. At the time, Bill Barr pushing this case forward. It was definitely a topic of discussion in the Trump administration leading up to the COVID-19 shutdown back then. So that's how this case came together. That's some of the conduct that's been alleged here. And now this scene that we're looking at outside of the courthouse, where we'll see Sam Brock shortly, you've got people that are obviously very happy with what has occurred here and the arrest of Maduro and his wife. You've got a number of individuals who are not happy with this and the U.S. efforts in Venezuela. The NYPD having to deploy a second ring of barricades, calling those in because of the size of the crowd outside of the courthouse. They do have a number of different ways to be able to get Maduro and his wife out of there and presumably back to the heliport in Wall Street on a,
walk
good
through
day.
that, Tom.
Yeah,
those steps.
So without going through some things that are there for security, and as somebody who's regularly in that courthouse, frankly, for our own security, there are a number of ways to get somebody out of that courthouse and then out of where this huge crowd is, basically to get them out via vehicle, to be able to get them to the Wall Street heliport if, in fact, they're going to use a helicopter. And then it's a very short flight. If it takes 60 seconds, I'd be shocked, back to that jail facility.
Tom Winter, thank you. I want to go now to Sam Brock, who was inside that courtroom for those historic moments as Nicolás Maduro and his wife were arraigned on American soil. Sam, tell us what it was like inside that room.
Hallie, one of the most remarkable arraignments you could ever imagine, right? You've covered court cases throughout the course of your career. You're hard-pressed to remember anything like this. So Nicolás Maduro walks into the courtroom with his wife, Cilia Flores, right around noon. And immediately, so first of all, he is wearing orange garb from the MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center, a black shirt over that. Hard to tell, Hallie, whether or not he was handcuffed or not when he first walked in, but he is right away shaking hands with all of his attorneys. He nods at the people in the gallery, both on the side where the public was seated as well as the journalists. It almost looked like at one point he cracked a smile, was greeting his attorneys, getting situated. His wife came in as well, Cilia Flores, I might add. It was hard to tell at first, but then this was brought up by their attorneys, had bandages on her face and had bruising around her eyes. They discussed the fact that she was injured during detention and even mentioned possible fractures to her back or other parts of her body when the question around medical attention came up. So we'll get back to that in a second. But when I say remarkable, so they come in, Maduro has 4 U.S. Marshals behind him. They sit directly behind Maduro. While he is seated then and facing the judge, Judge Hellerstein addresses the court. He proceeds to read the charges, certainly the narco-terrorism, the cocaine importation conspiracy, the weapons-related charges, gets through all of that, and then says to Nicolás Maduro, "Are you Nicolás Maduro?" And he says, Hallie, first, "I am Nicolás Maduro of Venezuela. I am president of the Republic of Venezuela. I have been kidnapped since January 3rd. I was captured at my home in Caracas, Venezuela," which at that point, Hallie, the judge steps in and says, "Wait a minute. We're going to get to all of that. I just want to know if you're Nicolás Maduro." And he says, "Yes, I am." And in fact, he's wearing headphones the entire time, right? Because he's hearing the interpretation, the translation. He actually interrupts the translator as she's trying to articulate to the judge and to the court what Maduro is saying. He's so eager to sort of state his case. So again, this was very anomalous in terms of what happens in what are normally perfunctory arraignments and hearings. So they go through that. The judge reads through the charges, okay? Then he asks him whether or not he's seen the indictment. And Maduro and his attorney, Barry Pollock, who, by the way, represented Julian Assange, well known in the field of criminal defense. He's also known for negotiating a plea agreement to get Assange out of jail, also represented one of the Enron executives who was fully acquitted on criminal fraud charges. He's representing Maduro in this case, and he said, "I have briefed my client, but he hasn't actually read the indictment." And so then the judge says, do you want the court to read the indictment? Maduro says, "No, I don't," but he does want to have consultation on it. The entire time this is going on, both Maduro and Flores are taking just scrupulous notes. I mean, you could see their notepads when they stood up at the end of the court proceeding, just filled with information. Maduro wanted to make sure that the court knew those were his notes. He's entitled to them. Am I allowed to keep them? The judge said, "Sure, you can keep the notes." So this all goes on, and then the judge asks Maduro whether or not he has been briefed on his rights, and by rights not just to counsel, but also to silence. And when that exchange goes back and forth again with the translator, he says, "This is the first I've been told of that." It's not clear whether or not Maduro was referring to whether or not he has to speak with police and law enforcement, or whether it was right to counsel, or what aspect of his rights he was just being informed about for the first time. That was a very interesting interaction as well. And of course, the pleas, right? So we get to the pleas. The judge asks Maduro how he pleads to these 4 counts. He says, "Soy inocente. I am innocent. I am not guilty. I am a decent man." At which point the judge again intervenes and says, "Okay, you were just looking for guilty or not guilty. Not a fuller explanation. Don't worry, there is going to be time for that." Very similar, by the way, with Cilia Flores as well. She says, "Yes, I am Cilia Flores, First Lady of the Republic of Venezuela." She acknowledges that she's seen a summary of the indictment, but not the actual indictment itself, and goes on and says, we're okay to waive the reading at this time. She planned on getting fully briefed, but he says, "You know your rights," and she says, "Yes, I do." She also says, "Not guilty, completely innocent," when she is asked whether or not she is guilty of those crimes. The narco-terrorism is just for Maduro, but the other 3 counts do apply to Cilia Flores. So this is all transpiring, Hallie, and then we find out, they have a right to consular notification.
That's right.
And they are both interested, both Maduro and his wife, in speaking with someone from a consular figure from their own government to get more information. Absolutely interested in that. And then one of the most bizarre things happens at the very end of this very brief arraignment. It was, 30 minutes or so. Maduro turns around, waves to the crowd. Not clear if he's waving at someone in particular or just in general, but a man stands up, and I want to quote this directly to you so I don't get it wrong. He says, "You will pay on behalf of Venezuela." And Maduro says, "In the name of God, I will be free." This is all happening at an arraignment. in front of dozens of people, right? I mean, we just know this is not normal playbook legal sort of stuff. So
Not at
all
all.
of that,
Sam,
I would just raise one other thing, and I'm sure you'll have some follow-ups here. If I may just raise one other point, which is that Barry Pollock, the attorney for Maduro, said that I absolutely plan on filing motions regarding the legality or illegality, and he used the word of Maduro's abduction, and also pointed out that he is a head of state and afforded certain rights of immunity. So expect in the days and months to come, those motions will be forthcoming. But they're not right now. Next steps in this, March 17th is 60 days from now. That's the next court hearing that's scheduled at the moment with Judge Hellerstein, and that's about discovery and sharing information that the prosecution has with Maduro and his legal team and Flores and her legal team. But just an extraordinary 30 minutes in U.S. federal court that just transpired.
Sam, a stunning play-by-play from you. I have some follow-ups for you, but I want to explain to people what they're seeing here. This is a live shot from above. We expect Nicolás Maduro and his wife to leave court. They will be transported back to that facility where they will be held behind bars for the remainder of these court proceedings. Sam, let me ask you about this outburst in court. Again, not something we typically see, as we have said so often over the course of the last couple of days here. Do we know who the person was that stood up and, it sounds like, Sam, yelled at Nicolás Maduro?
He did. He did. I wouldn't say he yelled. He just said, matter-of-factly, you will pay. The court officer there immediately pointed at the man and told him to stop talking. And I did see probably 2 minutes later, once the arraignment was over and everyone was preparing to leave the courtroom, he was apprehended by officials and taken away. What the consequences will be, not quite clear. But as we have this conversation about someone standing up in the face of Maduro, I will tell you, at 500 Pearl Street, where we are right now, the site of many a protest, there's dozens of people right now with Venezuelan flags that are happy and cheering the end of Maduro as the leader of Venezuela and calling for his justice, while just across basically a divide, there's a whole group of other individuals that are concerned with the manner in which the U.S. carried out this military action, and they're saying that it's illegal. So you have sort of these conflicting viewpoints on the doorsteps of the federal courthouse as this man, who to this point is unidentified, stands up solely, no one else was standing, and looks right at Maduro as he's waving and says, you will pay for this.
It sounds as though, Sam, that Maduro had a degree of command in the room, the ability to make those remarks about his character and about his innocence to the judge. Sometimes in these arraignments, we hear just a single word or two from the defendant. That was not the case here. Maduro addressing the person who stood up in court and addressed him. Was that your sense of how the proceedings went?
1,000%. And I will tell you, for Venezuelans who have lived under this regime, they're familiar with his showmanship. Talked about Peter Alexander this morning, the dancing on stage that the U.S. government in the recent weeks interpreted as some sort of act of defiance. Well, this is someone that clearly felt like a showman when he walked into the room, which I think was what was most striking to many of us. I mean, here he is walking in under the custody of U.S. Marshals, and he's nodding to everybody there, even kind of cracking a smile, waving as he leaves the courtroom. It was almost like he felt like he had a command of what's going on. Obviously, this is someone who's been the president of a country for the last 10 plus years, but he was literally interrupting the translator when she was trying to translate what he was saying and continuing this commentary with the judge when the judge was only looking for, 1 or 2 word answers. Now, obviously, he probably didn't understand the exact protocols of the U.S. legal system, but it was incredible to see just the presence that he had in that courtroom, that he felt comfortable enough to act as if he was running the show, not necessarily, the judge and the justice officials.
Maduro, it seemed at points, Sam, acknowledged that he didn't have command of the U.S. justice system. At one point saying to the judge, I didn't know I had some of those rights, more or less, as we are seeing now some of the movement now from outside court. Sam, stick with me because I have to ask, you mentioned seeing visible bandages and what appeared to be bruising on Cilia Flores. Any visible sign of injury on Nicolás Maduro?
No, none. His physical stature is just so tall. He was taller than the other 4 people that brought him into the room. He was erect. He felt, very energetic. He didn't seem like someone who had been injured. I mean, obviously, we've been documenting the fact that Maduro keeps showing thumbs up every time he is in front of a camera, whether that's at, the DAA processing department in Chelsea or it's underneath, the chopper as he's getting onto a helicopter at a helipad. He seems to be very much projecting this image of power. He did not seem injured. His gait was normal, but it was surprising for sure once you really started to pay attention to it, to see exactly what Cilia Flores' face looked like. I mean, there were clearly bandages there, obvious bruising, and I have a feeling that that's going to be brought up front and center here before too long.
Sam, stand by for 1 minute because we are seeing now this movement here in Manhattan, in New York City, what appears to be Maduro leaving court. Let me bring in Tom Winter, who has tracked movements like these countless times over the years. Where does Maduro head next? Where does Cilia Flores head next?
Right, so they're coming out of what's called as Park Row. After 9/11, Hallie, this whole area was sealed and locked down. After coming out of that federal courthouse, the green vehicle there is known as a Bearcat. That's a heavily armored vehicle, and the NYPD Highway Patrol now in the lead. This is also next to their headquarters. So this area is always generally very secure in Lower Manhattan. They've obviously got what's called a route set up. You'll see the police officers blocking traffic, so they will now be able to quickly take him. I have not received any reports that the Brooklyn Bridge has been shut down, so it looks like they'll probably get him back to the Wall Street heliport. This whole thing should take only several minutes at this point because they can block this off easily, and they've done this many times before. The reason for this, I know folks are going to look at it and say, look, this is an enormous amount of taxpayer dollars, and it is, that's being used to do this. It's just that in order to get him safely there without having an incident and disrupting this whole judicial process, having any civilians injured, any members of the public, they want to be able to get him to a spot where they can just fly him to Brooklyn. You might remember in previous high-profile proceedings, I'm thinking of El Chapo, when he was tried in New York. In other cases, they want to make sure that there's no members of the public that are injured. And to do that, they'd have to shut down the Brooklyn Bridge or other major arteries in New York City. And that's just something that becomes untenable. So it's easier to fly them. And all indications are at this point, we'll know fairly shortly here, because they have an opportunity either to get on the bridge or to get to the heliport. They will likely go to the heliport. This is right behind the entrance to NYPD's headquarters, as well as the federal courts downtown. And this is going to be an effort by the marshals, by the DEA, in order to get him there. And at this point, it looks like they are making the turn to get down to the heliport. That's at least where it looks like to me where they're going to head.
And that is presumably, Tom, where we will see another image of Maduro in person being walked back into the helicopter. We saw the earlier one just after sunrise, very early this morning, as Maduro was being taken out. Again, aware of the camera angles, candidly, aware of his visibility, aware that he was being watched by people around the world. And I want to bring back in Sam Brock to the conversation because, Sam, I understand that in just the last maybe 2-3 minutes here, we have heard now from Maduro's defense attorney for the first time outside court.
Yeah, so Jonathan Dean, star colleague at WNBC, apparently just spoke with Barry Pollock outside of court and asked him about comments that were asserted that he was abducted when Maduro said he was abducted by the U.S. government. And Pollock said something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing here, of what Mr. Maduro said in court speaks for itself. And that is part of the conversation that's going to be ensuing here in the coming weeks and months, Hallie, is the idea of using force in an international relations capacity like that, which is explicitly prohibited unless it's in defense of a country or it's sanctioned by the United Nations. And so what he meant in terms of the use of the word abduction is not clear. Maduro, well, at least it's clear enough that Maduro said he felt like he was kidnapped. Pollock used the word abduction, and he said it's complicated, it's voluminous in terms of the motions that we're going to be filing, but you can expect that that's where we will be taking this case next. Once they resume on March 17th, again, that's to reconnect and to be able to share and update the judge on where they are in terms of sharing documents and discovery. But it was striking to hear Pollock say what he said in court, his client, speaks for itself.
Let me go to Laura Jarrett, our senior legal correspondent. And Laura, the semantics matter when it comes to the legal proceedings here. The fact that Maduro used the word, as Sam is talking about, used the language kidnapped, his attorney talking about abduction, that's significant.
It's significant, not surprising, given his position on this, Hallie. But while he may feel it was a kidnapping or an abduction or the like, with some signal of something being unjustified, his attorney is still going to be under the burden to convince a judge down the line, which it sounds like he'll want to do, that his detention is not legally justified, right? And so there will be a number of different arguments to marshal in their favor on that. But this isn't a case that is as if it's routine in any sense of the word, or that this is happening all the time. And so they're going to have to, do what they can to marshal arguments without the benefit of a ton of precedent for similar circumstances. I can't really think of a similar situation. We've talked about Noriega in the past, but it's not as if this is happening on a routine basis so that they'll be able to marshal a bunch of cases in their favor. The Justice Department, on the other hand, has an enormous interest in this case and seeing him put away for a long time. As we've talked about, he was charged back in 2020. They didn't, by any stretch, do anything like this. They didn't make any attempt, at least as far as we know, and reporting has shown, to manage to extract him back then, probably believing that they couldn't. And so now they're going to be working tooth and nail to try to keep him behind bars. But it will be up to that judge to decide down the line, imagining in months from now, whether or not his detention and his arrest was valid, whether or not his rights were valid or were violated in some way. And then, Hallie, of course, there will be appeal after appeal. And so I think, for people who are watching this all play out, during that time, unless his lawyers can figure out a way to get him out, he is going to be behind those bars in Brooklyn, and it is not a pleasant place. This is a place that's been subject to lawsuit after lawsuit for the conditions in there. It is going to be a far cry from the kinds of places that he's been enjoying up until this point.
And you are seeing now those images from earlier today, Maduro leaving that Brooklyn facility, flashing that thumbs up, and of course those images there of the military operation overnight. There it is again as we are watching. And just to give you a sense, listen, our helicopter's in the air with our NBC News New York station there. We are tracking the movements of Maduro and his wife as they are being transported here. Let me bring in Richard Engel, because as this is happening, Richard, on the ground for us in the region in Colombia, we have heard Maduro now in court insist he is the president of Venezuela, and similar emphasis from his son, who is speaking at almost the same time that his father was in court to the Venezuelan National Assembly, saying his father is the rightful leader of that country.
He is, and I think it's fair to say that all across Latin America right now, people are watching this. This is designed to send a message, as you've said, and all of your guests have said, and all of the reporting that has been done. This is not just another typical court case. A head of state was taken by U.S. Special Forces, abducted, brought to the United States to face trial. He's now professing his innocence. Some of the imagery here is clearly designed to send fear to the United States opponents in the region, designed to send fear to the leaders of Cuba, designed to send fear to the leader of Colombia, the president of Colombia. President Trump has mentioned them specifically. He said that the president of Colombia better watch his backside, and that the Cubans may be on their last legs, the Cuban regime. So this is a show of force, an intimidating show of force. But you mentioned also several times that this is completely unprecedented. This is unprecedented, but it is very, it is reminding me of something that I witnessed about 20 years ago. I was standing exactly where, or in the same situation where Sam Brock was right now, and he did an amazing job giving us the play-by-play of what had happened inside that courtroom. I was in a similar courtroom in Iraq when the dictator of that country was brought in for an arraignment. And he said almost word for word what Nicolás Maduro said today. He said that he is the president of Iraq, that this is illegitimate, that none of this should apply to him. He asked questions. The judge tried to say this is just an arraignment. We just want your name. He started to present his defense. He was stopped from doing that. Almost exactly the same as what we're seeing right now. Ultimately, Saddam Hussein was hanged for war crimes. But his defense team was making this same argument, and he was making the same argument. And he was also trying to flash a smile. I was in the courtroom. He was giving thumbs up. He was trying to show that he was very much in command. So we have been down this road at least one time before in quite a unique historic parallel.
Our Richard Engel on the ground in the region in Colombia. It is just after 1 o'clock here on the East Coast, 10 in the West, and you are looking live now at some of these images from New York City as Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores are on their way back to a detention facility after their arraignment in U.S. federal court just minutes ago. Both of them pleading not guilty to those federal charges of drug trafficking conspiracy, with Maduro saying, "I am president of the Republic of Venezuela." He says, "I am here kidnapped since Saturday." You see his quote here, saying he was captured at his home in Caracas, Venezuela. Obviously, that was the military operation, large scale, by the United States, late Friday into Saturday morning, in which Maduro and Flores were extracted to the United States, flown back to New York, where they have been in that detention facility for the course of the last 48 hours. I want to bring in now Ana Vanessa Herrero, a freelance reporter who is in Caracas. She has been reporting on the ground from inside Venezuela for us. Ana, the last 2-3 hours, what has it been like where you are?
Well, believe it or not, I was expecting, when I imagined this moment, I was expecting people on the streets, people manifesting and saying what they thought of. But really, this is not the case. People are being very cautious. They're staying home. Those who started their regular activities this Monday are just going to work and then back to a supermarket, a pharmacy, and then back home. But we do have a strong reaction within the National Assembly of Venezuela. Right now, as you were reporting what was happening inside that courthouse, the National Assembly of Venezuela was, and the state television was broadcasting Nicolás Maduro's guerra, the son of Nicolás Maduro, and he was almost crying. His voice completely broke, saying that we are going to embrace again here in Venezuela. He said that he was kidnapped. He said that the two, Cilia Flores and Nicolás Maduro, were kidnapped by the United States, and that Venezuela was not going to be a colony. And then the now president of the National Assembly, the brother of Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president, said that in the place where Cilia Flores sit in a chair inside of the National Assembly he left a red flower, trying to symbolize her, because she said there's one missing, and that is Cilia Flores. So they put a little flower there just to just symbolize that it was her. So this is very. I mean, there's a lot of information going on. At the same time, he was declaring not guilty, and she was declaring herself not guilty. This was happening in the National Assembly, and all eyes in Caracas are right there, right now.
And what we are looking at, Ana, thank you so much for your reporting. What we are looking at now on the left side of your screen is our Tom Winter reports, the exit of the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, where police have appeared to have shut down one of the lanes, and Maduro seems to be traveling by car now to that Brooklyn jail. We are keeping an eye on all of those movements. Let me bring back in Sam Brock, who is outside that Manhattan court, was inside the room as Maduro and his wife were being arraigned. And as you heard Ana just report, Sam, Venezuelans were watching, Venezuelan Americans here in the United States watching as well.
It's so interesting, the idea that there's this mixture of emotions for Venezuelans right now, Hallie. Obviously, the euphoria, the celebration, the unbridled happiness. For those of us that know Venezuelans in our life and are experiencing those joys of thinking that this brutal dictatorship may be over, but also wondering what comes next from this illegitimate government, and are they going to stay in power now that Maduro has been deposed? I will say there certainly seems to be some of that here in terms of just the crowds that have shown up in front of the courthouse, but also, honestly, this acrimony between those who are protesting right now against the idea the U.S. had no right to do this, to invade a sovereign nation and to take its leader and bring him back to the United States on U.S. soil to face justice, versus those who are just so elated at the idea that someone, and I will sort of lay out in the indictment, Maduro is accused of not just coordinating with FARC, right, conspiring with FARC. This was the superseding indictment back in 2020. But also in the last 4 or 5 years, the U.S. government lays out a case where he's working with the Sinaloa cartel, with Tren de Aragua, that you have someone who is essentially running state-sponsored narco-terrorism, and at a time when the 30 million people that live in Venezuela are struggling with rolling blackouts and obtaining basic medical devices and food and water and toilet paper and all the things that we repeatedly report on when there are shortages of in Venezuela, that he was enriching his own pockets and the pockets of his inner circle and the military. And so you are seeing this outpouring of Venezuelan Americans. Certainly that diaspora stretches, I think, as Tom said, from Miami to Madrid. all over the world. We're seeing it here in New York. We're seeing it in Miami. But there is also the realization that there is an intense legal battle that is going to be taking place, and whether or not these motions may be successful on behalf of Maduro's attorneys that this was an unlawful capture. So all of these different layers of a very complicated subject are all interspersing right now together as we are just watching this extraordinary first arraignment and now visual trip for Maduro and his wife Cilia back to MDC, back to the Metropolitan Detention Center.
Sam, thank you. Extraordinary, to say the least, as we're keeping an eye on these live aerial images from our NBC New York station and their chopper. We have heard, as Sam talks about the legal battle, we have now heard from Nicolás Maduro's new defense attorney, Barry Pollock, speaking outside court just minutes ago. I want to play for you what he said. Watch this.
And just in terms of his capture, because you guys did raise the concern regarding what he called a kidnapping.
I think what President Maduro said in court speaks for itself.
And a reminder of what Nicolás Maduro said in court. He said he is a decent man. He said he is the president of Venezuela. He said he was kidnapped from his home in Caracas by the U.S. military. You see it there. I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander, because Peter now continues the clock for the DOJ to lay out the legal proceedings in the face of the arguments that the defense team will put up.
The president himself, Hallie, on that very topic just yesterday, saying that Nicolás Maduro and his wife would face the full might of American justice. We heard initially from the Attorney General Pam Bondi on Saturday, moments after we learned about this capture, the arrest of Maduro, that Maduro would face the full wrath of American justice. But this process is going to play out like any other court case would here. But this one, of course, is unique. Still, the Justice Department is putting a lot of resources behind this effort right now, as we've now learned, likely the next court appearance for Maduro to take place just a couple of months from now. There are a lot of questions to be raised with the Justice Department, with the president himself. He has no public events scheduled for today. But, you know, how does the White House respond to this argument from Maduro and his team that this was a military abduction, that he has been kidnapped, language that was initially echoed by the now acting, the interim president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, and her comments immediately following the arrest, basically saying that this was an illegal kidnapping, saying that there was only one president of Venezuela, and in fact saying that that remains Nicolás Maduro at this time. A couple things are striking, and Sam made this point earlier, but I think it is worth repeating, which is just the presence that Maduro had, it appears, in that courtroom there. Clearly, he is a very large man, and he is one who, for more than 13 years, has been on the world stage, succeeding Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. And as a senior White House official said to me, part of that performative nature of his leadership is something that really sort of got underneath the skin of some of those here at the White House, that the members of the inner circle for the president viewed the sort of public displays, the repeated displays of dancing, the rejection of multiple offers for him to surrender as evidence, basically, of not just Maduro's defiance, but really his mocking, in the words of this official, the president, and trying to call the president's bluff. They say, this official says, that the president does not bluff on that matter, but it's very clear that Maduro is not going to go down, in effect, without a fight, not a physical one, but legally. He made very clear his view that he, to this day, remains the president of the country that he was whisked away from.
Peter, thank you. Questions of legality now raised not just by Maduro's defense team, but by some in Congress as well. And for that, I want to get to our chief Capitol Hill correspondent, Ryan Nobles. Some of them, Ryan, will be briefed here in Washington as lawmakers have returned from their holiday break later on today.
Yeah, this will be the first opportunity for members of Congress to get a firsthand understanding as exactly what the administration's arguments are for going into Venezuela, for removing Maduro and his wife, and not informing Congress or looping them in or asking for authorization as a result. At 5:30 tonight, here in Washington, a group of high-level administration officials, including the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, will all brief the Gang of Eight, which is the group of leaders, both Republican and Democrat, of the key committees of jurisdiction and the leadership of both the House and Senate. Now, we don't expect that when they come out of this meeting that they'll give us too much information as to what was told is it will be a classified briefing. But we should get some sense of whether or not these members of Congress are comfortable with the way that this process has played itself out. Some Democrats have outright called it illegal. They have forecasted the possibility of a quagmire that the United States could get itself involved in. Hallie, we should learn a lot more about what Congress thinks about this intervention here over the next couple of days now that they're back here in Washington.
Ryan Nobles, thank you. I want to bring in our moderator of Meet the Press, Kristen Welker, who is joining us now. And Kristen, there is the legal component of this. There is the political component of this. There is the foreign policy component of this, with a lot on the line for the Trump administration.
This is arguably the biggest foreign policy test yet for President Trump in this second administration. Hallie, we're getting our first little snapshot of how the public views this. The Washington Post took a poll. I want to stress this was a snap poll taken in the days and hours after Nicolás Maduro was seized from Venezuela. But some really fascinating findings. 42% disapprove of sending the U.S. military into Venezuela to capture Nicolás Maduro. 40% approve, okay? So pretty divided evenly there, Hallie. 18% say they're unsure. That's expected given the nature of this snap poll. But notably, 63% say President Trump should have notified Congress. So that really speaks to the point that Ryan was making. I think that's part of where this argument is going to go. What, if any, role should Congress play now, particularly, Hallie, particularly if President Trump, if the Trump administration decides to take future action? And then, of course, we'll watch the MAGA base very closely. Right now, largely unified behind him. But if this drags out, that could change. Hallie.
Kristen Welker, thank you very much for that. Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro and his wife Cilia Flores on their way back to that Brooklyn detention facility, capping a stunning 48 hours with their not guilty pleas in U.S. federal court and setting the stage for what is sure to be a bruising legal battle ahead, perhaps a political one for President Trump. That concludes our coverage.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.